Rancher lived alone for 5 years, until the Bigfoot tribe took his dog. Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from, what town or city you're calling home tonight. And when this tale reaches its end, don't forget to give it a rating from 0 to 10. Now lean back, get comfortable, and let the story carry you away. The creatures that took my dog left claw marks 8 feet up the trees. That night the snow fell so heavy I couldn't even see the front step of my cabin, the kind of snow that swallows sound and swallows things whole. Scout, my loyal dog, barked 3 times. Just 3. Then he charged into the white like he always did when he sensed something was wrong. He never came back. I followed his paw prints into the woods. Didn't take long before I found something else. Claw marks. Deep, deliberate, carved into the trunk of an old pine, full 2 feet above my head. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. This was something else. Something that hunts, and it was hunting me. If you've ever lost the only living soul who stayed by your side, when the whole damn world turned its back on you, then you understand. You understand what it's like to stare into the trees and feel it staring back. So if you've been there, if you've lost something that was never just an animal but a piece of your last bit of home, tell me in the comments. Because that was the night I realized something I never wanted to believe. I wasn't alone out here anymore. And whatever was out there, it had just taken the only friend I had left. Tell me, have you ever sat alone in an empty house, listened to the wind tapping against the walls, and realized there's nothing left worth holding on to? My name's Jim Morris, and once upon a time I had a life that most folks would have called complete. Over 300 acres of good ranch land. A wife I believed would be my partner till the end of my days. And a daughter, Emma, with eyes like the early May sun after a long winter. Then came that Tuesday morning. A single envelope. No note. No warning. Just dry ink on bleached paper. And the cold scrawl of a lawyer's hand. She took everything. The house my grandfather built with his bare hands. Half the land I bled on to make fertile. And worst of all, she took Emma. 2 weeks later, I sat in our old living room, the same place we used to string up Christmas lights together, and stared at the ceiling, now stained with blotches of mold like rotting memories. An empty bottle of whiskey lay beneath the chair, and a knife, buried halfway in a block of pine wood, waiting for a hand weak enough to give in. But I stood up. Not because of hope. Hell, I didn't have any left. I stood because I knew I couldn't die in the place that used to be home. 3 weeks later, I packed up my old pickup truck with the only 2 souls who'd never left my side. Ranger, my mountain smart horse, and Scout, my aging border collie, who curled up at my feet every night, no matter how drunk or broken I'd become. We drove into the Cascade Mountains, past where the roads end, past where cell service gasps its last breath. The tires groaned through cold mud and stubborn roots like the earth itself wanted to seal me in, make sure I never came back. I settled into an old hunting cabin left behind by a man named Pete Jameson. It sat cradled in a forgotten valley nearly 40 miles from town. No electricity, no signal, no people. Just the hiss of wind through pine branches and the scent of damp rot in every floorboard. That cabin became the tomb I chose to crawl into. Not to die, but to disappear. And if you've ever had a day where everything you thought was forever turned to smoke, if you've ever looked in the mirror and seen nothing staring back, drop a comment below and write, I've hit bottom too. Because for me, the day I closed that cabin door was the day the outside world stopped existing. Stay tuned. This story is only just beginning. Comment I've hit bottom too if this story echoes something deep in you. And if you're still listening, you're not alone out here. Subscribe for the next chapter when the silence finally broke and something came scratching at my door. Part 1. The House of Silent Souls. If you've ever lived somewhere so quiet you could hear only the wind, the ash as it fell, and the sound of your own heart beating. Tell me, what did you see in that silence? The first time I laid eyes on it, The cabin looked like a block of rotting timber swallowed in morning mist, as if time had forgotten it, with a weary sigh. The tin roof was rusted, the porch steps splintered and broken. Even the front door leaned sideways like it was bowing to the wind. And yet, it stood. It hadn't collapsed, and in some strange way, it felt like it had been waiting for me. Pete Jameson hadn't lied. The old log house his grandfather built back in the 1920s still held its bones. There was a hand-dug well, a small horse stall, and a creek that looped around the edge of the forest like a soft noose made of silver thread. I stepped out of the truck boots, crunching into a patch of brittle grass. Scout jumped down from the truck bed, nose to the dirt, quiet but alert. Ranger let out a soft whinny, his mane catching the wind like breath from something older than us both. Peace didn't come crashing in. It crept, the way a room feels after a funeral, no words spoken because everything that needed saying already had been. The cabin didn't ask why I'd come. It just creaked open its crooked door and let me in. Month 1. Learning how to exist. Again. The first week I fixed the old wood stove. Its hinges had snapped and the smoke nearly choked Scout out on that first cold night. I stripped out rotted walls, patched door latches, and stuffed scraps of cloth into the drafty seams between the logs. My hands bled with splinters, and somehow, I'd never felt more alive. Each morning I rose before the sun carrying buckets to the well. Each afternoon I walked the creekside with Scout beside me, trying to memorize every bend, every tree that grew at a crooked angle. And each night I lit the oil lamp sat by the fire and wrote in an old leather journal day 11. Colder than yesterday. Scout barked west, heard an owl. No one else, still here. Sometimes I'd stand in the middle of the yard, neck craned back to stare at the sky full of stars. No streetlights, no cars, no cell towers humming. Just one undeniable truth: I was still breathing. And somehow, that breath no longer felt as heavy as it did back in the house I used to call home. Scout, my companion in silence. Scout liked this place. He ran like he was claiming it for us, marking corners of earth like he knew we finally had a home. Every evening he'd stretch out on the porch, eyes half closed, ears always twitching when the wind shifted. I never taught him that. He just knew. And every time I placed my hand on the thick fur of his neck, I thought of Emma. She used to call him her curly friend, had a way of scratching just beneath his chin that made him flop over like a kitten. But now, it was just me and Scout, and the things I couldn't name, like the hollow in my chest when I remembered the sound of a child's laughter. Ranger, the weary warrior. Ranger took nearly a month before he'd let me approach him without flinching, not from fear, but because he was used to movement, to voices, to the bustle of ranch life. Out here, all he had was me, and I didn't talk much anymore. But slowly, he adapted. He began stepping out of the stall on his own each morning, walking to the creek for a drink, then waiting patiently by the hay bin until I came around. He was slower now, but steady. And sometimes I'd catch him staring deep into the forest as if listening for something that didn't speak in words. Day 42. The cabin feels alive again. That's what I wrote on a damp night in early April. The rotted wood was replaced. A hook by the back wall held Scout's leash. The well had a new lever, and the horse stall was cleaner than any room I'd lived in since the divorce. That night, with the oil lamp glowing soft in the corner, a cigarette between my fingers and the crackle of fire warming my boots, for the first time in years, I didn't want to leave. Scout lay sleeping just outside the door. Ranger murmured a soft whinny in the stall, and I exhaled into the silence, a long, slow breath that didn't feel like sorrow anymore. That's when I realized I didn't miss voices. Not the calls, not the arguments behind the old bedroom door, not even Emma's voice, except maybe the sound of her laughter caught in the wind, and I got scared. Not of what I'd lost, but of how gently I was letting it all go. Peace was what I'd searched for my whole life, and now that it lay in my hands, I wasn't sure I was still the man I used to be. If you've ever found peace so quiet it frightened you, leave a single word below, "I understand Jim." Because sometimes the scariest thing ain't the sound of a gunshot. It's the silence that makes you never want to go back. From that moment on, I wasn't just a man in hiding. I was a soul, living among other silent souls. I just didn't know yet. They were watching back. Part 2. When time softens the wound. If you've ever lived through a stretch of time where pain no longer cuts sharp, but there's nothing left to remember either, where you no longer cry, but you sure as hell don't smile, then tell me in the comments. I felt that too. Because that's exactly where I was. My first spring, my first summer, and for the first time in my life, I knew what peace felt like, without the burden of memory. Winter had left like an old animal too tired to roar, no howls, no tracks, just a damp chill clinging to the cabin walls. That first March morning, sunlight broke through the trees. I didn't even notice it at first, not until Scout stepped outside, tilted his head back, took in a deep breath, and turned to look at me, as if to say, "We're still alive." The forest was waking. New grass pushed through layers of dead leaves. The creek swelled at the banks with melted snow. I began waking earlier, not for chores, not for duty, but simply because I wanted to. I wanted to feel sunlight kiss the well handle, to hear Scout's soft bark near the tree line, to hear Ranger's quiet whinny when I opened the stall door, his wordless way of saying "mornin'." I wrote everything down, as if without my notes, this life might vanish into the woods like it never happened. Day 84. The air's warmer. Ranger breathes steady. Scout runs farther. Scout taught me things I never knew I needed to learn. He'd lick his paw and turn west when rain was coming. He'd freeze ears high when something foreign stirred in the wind. Every morning before I stepped out, he'd circle the clearing, patrolling like a quiet sheriff. That's what I started calling him, Sheriff. Not as a joke, but because I realized something important. I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. Not while he was here. There was one afternoon he vanished, nearly 2 hours, and I nearly lost my mind. I thought I'd lost him the way I lost Emma, but then he came trotting back, tail high, carrying a large bone in his mouth, his ear nicked and bleeding just a little. I didn't ask what happened. I just dropped to my knees, wrapped my arms around him, and whispered, "Don't leave me. Please." Ranger started walking up to me in the mornings. No rope, no call. Just waited by the water trough, letting me lay my hand gently on his neck. Horses don't show emotion like dogs do. But when I ran my hand down his mane, I could feel it, that deep, unspoken trust rising in each breath. One morning I overslept. When I opened my eyes, Ranger was standing quietly on the porch looking through the window, like a patient friend just waiting. Day 106. I'm no longer in pain, but I feel empty. I stopped writing after that line, just sat there, watching the lamp flame dance, listening to the forest begin to hum with early summer life. Then my hand trembled a little as I wrote, "What if?" I'm starting to forget Emma. Not on purpose, it's just... I couldn't recall her voice anymore. I remembered her face, her eyes, the scent of her hair when she hugged me. But her voice, it was slipping away like fog at sunrise. Have you ever feared losing the memory of the one you loved most? Not because of time, but because the very peace you found is quietly erasing them. If you have, write this below. I don't want to forget. I built a small garden behind the cabin. Scout chased off the squirrels. Ranger trampled half my cucumber patch, but I couldn't bring myself to be mad. The forest had grown full again, alive with color and sound. One evening, I swear I heard a child laughing in the wind, just for a moment, then it vanished. I didn't ask why, didn't chase the sound, just looked up at the sky and breathed. There was one sunset. I stopped mid-swing while chopping wood. Sweat rolled down my back. Golden light spilled across the trees. Scout lay beneath a pine tail, flicking lazily. Ranger grazed nearby in the tall grass. And I stood there surrounded by 3 living beings in a moment so calm it could have been painted. And I felt Nothing. No joy. No sorrow. No longing. No love. Just nothingness. That night, I opened Emma's journal, a little yellow notebook I'd carried in my pack since leaving town. I read her crooked little letters again. I wish you wouldn't be sad anymore, Daddy. When you have mountains and a horse, tell me stories, okay? I sat by the fire, Scout resting his head on my knee, Ranger watching from the porch quiet. And I realized Emma would never read my stories. She'd never ride Ranger, never throw her arms around Scout again. I had survived winter. I had made it through spring. I planted, I wrote, I ate, I slept. But somewhere along the way, I was forgetting how to love. If you've lived so long in silence, you're no longer sure if you're living or just surviving. Let me know. Just say, I'm still here. Because that summer, I stopped hurting, but I also stopped holding on. Part 3. The Call from the Ancient Woods. There are forests out there that should never be entered, but you don't know that, not until you've already gone too far. It was early October when I rode down into Cedar Falls again, first time in 3 months. The morning air was sharp enough to turn your breath into smoke. Scout trotted beside Ranger like always, and the trail was covered in fallen leaves, like nature had laid out a carpet leading me back to the world I'd left behind. Murphy's General Store hadn't changed much. Same sun-faded sign, same 3 crooked cars parked out front. And behind the register, Helen gray hair pinned up neat was the first to smile when she saw me. You here for coffee? Or to hear something strange? She asked, eyes flicking toward Scout, who'd already wandered off to sniff the back corner. I smiled, shook my head. Not in the mood for ghost stories today, Helen? She tilted her head. Shame, because this one's not like the others, Jim. The Nest in the Woods. She began the story in a voice that dipped just below a whisper, like she was afraid the trees outside might overhear. 2 hunters came back from the North Fork of Dead Man's Creek last week, she said. They didn't bring back a kill. They brought back a story, said they found something. Not a cabin, not a shelter, a nest, so big a man could stand upright inside it. I chuckled, about to offer a joke, but Helen raised a hand, serious now. Let me finish. She said they found footprints too. 18 inches long, pressed 2 inches deep into hard earth. Not bear, not man, something bipedal, something heavy. I was about to ask more when she shook her head. That's all I know. But Jim. How far is Dead Man's Creek from your cabin? I swallowed. 10 miles, maybe less. And right then I felt it, that old chill working its way up my spine. Some questions. Wake up. What should stay asleep? All the way back up the trail, I kept hearing those words loop through my head. A nest a man can stand in. 18-inch tracks, just 10 miles from my door. Scout kept glancing at me like he could feel the shift in the air. Ranger's pace never changed, but his ears twitched constantly. Now, I don't believe in ghosts. Don't buy into Bigfoot or mountain myths. But there was something about the way Helen spoke. Something that didn't sound like folklore. Curiosity is a kind of memory. It doesn't rise because you lack knowledge, but because something inside you remembers what it was like to be afraid. And I knew I'd have to go see it for myself. 3 days into the unknown, I packed for the trip like I was preparing for my first winter in the mountains. 3 days of dried food, knife rifle flint oil lamp notebook, and Scout who stayed glued to my side the whole time. Dead Man's Creek has no roads, only narrow paths half swallowed by rotting leaves and time. The first day we passed through towering pines. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy. No cars, no birds, just the creak of leather tack and Ranger's steady breathing. I don't remember when the feeling started. Just that by afternoon, Scout froze mid-step, ears up, letting out a low whine. Ranger stopped too, turning his head toward the trees like he heard something I couldn't. I looked around, saw nothing. But the feeling that something was watching us had already begun to set in. The nest. Something that shouldn't exist midday on the second day. Scout disappeared. Only for a few minutes, but long enough for my heart to start pounding. I tied Ranger to a tree and followed the barks. And that's when I saw it. A clearing too clean, like it had been swept bare. And in the center, the nest. Taller than I was, at least 8 feet across. Woven deliberately from thick branches. Not random, not nature. This wasn't a pile of debris. Not a bear den. This was a structure, built to live in. Scout circled the edge, barking, growling low. I called him back, hand already on the rifle, slung over my shoulder, not out of fear but instinct. I stepped closer, knelt to peer inside. Dark, damp, a rank smell like sun-rotted animal hide blended with something unnatural, something wrong. I backed away, and then I saw the footprints. Long, wide, every toe clear in the dirt, 18 inches, sunk deep like the being that made them was twice my weight. I took pictures, made plaster casts, wrote down every detail, but in my head only one thought repeated: this can't be real. That night I couldn't sleep. Scout kept pacing the camp, ears high, teeth showing. Ranger pawed the ground, let out a worried whinny. He hadn't done that since our first winter. I sat beside the fire, notebook in hand, and breathed as quietly as I could, because I knew I had touched something I wasn't meant to. And from that moment on, I wasn't just an observer anymore. If you've ever been so curious, you had to ask yourself, what would have happened if I hadn't gone, tell me below, I've stepped into the dark too? Because sometimes we don't explore to discover. We explore because we've forgotten how to live without asking. I left Dead Man's Creek with samples, notes, and questions carved into my chest. I didn't know it yet, but I had opened a door, and on the other side, something was waiting for me to come back. Part 4. The Shelter of Shadows. They don't just live out here. They build, they watch, and now they know who I am. I returned to the cabin on the 3rd day after Dead Man's Creek. My body was tired, but my mind refused to rest. I kept going over the photos in my camera, that massive nest, the way it was constructed. Branches woven not by chance, but with design like someone had drawn blueprints first. I've built horse stalls, repaired cabin walls. I know the difference between random and intentional, and that nest was intentional. Something was awake. 2 nights after I got back, just past 2 a.m., Scout let out a low whine. Not a bark, not a growl, just a quiet moan like he was trying to wake me without waking the whole world. I sat up. The fire crackled soft in the stove. Ranger was still in the stall, but Scout stood at the door, ears high, tail stiff and low. I grabbed the oil lamp, stepped to the window. Outside, the forest was so dark it seemed light couldn't exist in it at all. And then I heard it. A branch snapped. Not the wind, not a squirrel, not a deer, a footstep. Have you ever heard a small sound and felt your spine turn to ice? Not because it was loud, but because every instinct you've got knows whatever made that sound. Already knows you're there. I stood in the dark, one hand on the rifle hanging beside the door, and for the first time since that first mountain winter, I was afraid. When Scout didn't come back, the next morning I decided to check the perimeter. Scout ran ahead like always, but this time, he didn't come back. 15 minutes. 30. I called out. No answer. I saddled up, took the rifle and flashlight, followed his paw prints through damp earth. And then I found it. A shelter meant for living. Tucked in a low grove of forest, cleared of all grass and fallen limbs, stood a dome-shaped structure. Half of a sphere woven from thick branches, some as wide as my forearm. Not a bird nest, not a hunter's lean-to, not a bear's den, a dwelling. There was a doorway, a slanted roof, even a vent-like hole near the top. And it looked like it had been there a long time. Scout paced the edge of the clearing, growling low and uncertain. He wouldn't go near the entrance. I crouched down and looked inside. A pelt, some kind of animal hide, lined the floor. stones arranged in a perfect arc. One corner stained dark like fire had once burned there, though no ash remained. I turned to leave and saw the footprints, 18 inches long, 8 inches wide, pressed nearly an inch and a half into the earth. I dropped to the ground, heartbeat pounding, not because they were so big, but because they were so clear. Toes, heel, even skin ridges like fingerprint lines. Not a bear, not a man, but closer to man than anything I'd ever imagined. I don't know how long I sat there. When I finally stood, my hands were shaking from the cold. Scout pressed close against my leg, whimpering not out of fear but warning. He was trying to say, "They know we were here." The questions that follow you home. I said nothing on the way back. Not to Scout, not to myself, but in my mind 100 voices whispered all at once. If they can build this, where are they? Why come so close to the cabin? Why haven't they harmed anyone? Or are they just watching? Back home, I washed my hands, made soup, pretended life was still the same. But that night, as I wrote in my journal, day 196, shelter located 2 miles from cabin. Tracks confirmed, structure complex. I paused and added one more line. I don't think I'm the only one keeping records anymore. Maybe I'm already written in their book. Have you ever felt watched, but couldn't tell by who? If you have just right, I've seen it too. Because in that moment, I understood something terrible. I didn't discover them. They let me see. I set the journal down, turned out the lamp, and lay there in the dark listening to Scout breathe by the door. The darkness outside wasn't silence anymore. It was waiting, and deep inside my chest, I knew they're coming back. Part 5. The watching begins. They didn't knock, they didn't enter, they just stood there and watched. I stopped talking about it, didn't write, didn't speak, didn't go near that shelter again. Instead, I clung to the old rhythms, splitting wood, feeding Ranger, logging the weather in shorthand no one else would understand. Scout grew quieter. He no longer roamed far, wouldn't go more than 20 paces from the cabin. Days were fine. Nights began to change. The oil lamp no longer brought me comfort. Sleep broke like glass, not because of any clear sound, but because of a presence, a certainty, that I was being watched. My cabin sat in a clearing 30 steps across, ringed by forest. By day it was a yard. By night, it became a border. The first night, a shadow on the edge. The first time I saw it, it was standing still as stone on the eastern tree line. Tall, black, motionless. It didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there. I picked up the oil lamp, moved to the window, parted the curtain just an inch. My eyes met something I'll never unsee. For a moment that stretched forever, we stared at each other, man and something else. And then, without turning, it vanished. Melted into the tree line like it had never been there at all. Have you ever had a night when darkness was no longer just darkness, when you looked out the window and felt something looking back? If so, type one thing below. I know that feeling. After that night, Scout stopped sleeping on the porch. He curled up tight against the doorhead on his paws, body taut. Every time the wind shifted, his ears shot up. Every time I turned out the lamp, he let out a soft whine. I'd rest a hand on his back, stroke the fur along his spine. That old friend of mine was guarding against something I couldn't name. And I knew he was scared. Worse than that, I knew he was right. The third night, not alone. Anymore, I woke at 2:17 a.m. No reason. Just opened my eyes and knew it was out there. I didn't turn on the lamp, didn't reach for the rifle. Just stepped to the window and looked north. Nothing. But my spine froze like river ice. Then Scout made a sound, not a bark. It caught in his throat, a choking growl like a creature smart enough to know noise could cost something. I turned, and through the thin curtain gap, I saw it again. Only now there were two, one on the west edge of the clearing, one just beyond it. Not moving, not hiding, watching. I shut the window, locked the door, sat down in my chair, didn't breathe for a while. Not because I feared dying, but because I understood something deeper. This was no longer my land. Day 203. I've been replaced. That's what I wrote in my journal at 3:04 a.m. I don't know what they are, and honestly, I don't care about the names anymore. Bigfoot, creature, cryptid. What I do know is this: I'm living on territory that belongs to something that doesn't see me as owner. And every night, they remind me. Have you ever felt your own home turn unfamiliar? Felt every step you take being logged by something you'll never see? Then tell me, I'm not the only one. The sixth night. A new kind of standoff. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat beside the door. Scout curled against my feet. The oil lamp turned down low to a whisper of flame, and I waited. At 2:43 a.m., I saw it. A tall shadow framed between two trees. Still, silent. This time, I didn't look away. I stared, held its gaze. I don't know if it looked back, but I felt it, like static in my teeth, like thunder before it breaks. I see you. That's what I thought, and I'm not stepping back anymore. It didn't move, didn't charge, didn't vanish. It simply faded back into the trees. I hadn't won, but I hadn't lost either. And in that moment, I realized something had changed. I extinguished the lamp. Didn't write another word. Scout laid his head on my lap. Outside, the forest breathed. But now, I knew. That gaze had never left. It had just waited for me to be still enough to finally feel it. Part 6. Scout is gone. A loyal dog stays when the world leaves you behind. And when he leaves, you're left with nothing left to hold. That afternoon, the wind changed. I was splitting wood by the stable when Scout let out a low whine. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just turned his head toward the woods and stared, longer than usual, like he was hearing something my ears were never meant to catch. Ranger grew restless too, pawing the boards, stamping the floor, his eyes fixed westward. I stepped over, laid my hand on his forehead. It was damp. Something was in the wind, something we couldn't see but every living thing could feel. I shut every door, checked every latch, stuffed another log into the fire. Scout lay tight against the front door, ears on high alert, eyes wide and unblinking. The snowstorm rolled in just before 10 p.m., heavy, blinding. White turned everything silent. The wind hissed through the cabin joints like a dying breath just beyond the porch. I sat by the window oil lamp flickering. The wind rattled the glass. Then, Scout stood up. No growl, no bark. He stepped toward the door and scratched, softly, like asking permission. I said no, not now, not in this. He turned to look at me, and I swear, even now, I can't hold that gaze in my memory for long. It wasn't fear, wasn't defiance. It was something final, like he'd already made his choice. I stepped back, and before I could drop the latch, he ran. The door flew open, and all I heard was the fading sound of his paws disappearing into the white. I shouted, grabbed my rifle, ran out into the gale. Wind slapped my face, snow burned my eyes. But Scout was already gone. No bark, no howl, no sound at all. Just me and the deafening silence of an open door where something loyal had vanished. Have you ever lost the only thing that still loved you without a chance to say stay? Then say it now if you need to. I didn't get to hold on. I grabbed the flashlight, the rifle, and his name. Scout over and over, I threw it into the woods. No echo came back. The snow erased everything in minutes. Not even paw prints remained. But then, something, a branch, snapped halfway, and hanging above it was Scout's old silver collar, the one he'd worn since Emma was a child, hanging 8 feet off the ground. I couldn't breathe, couldn't feel the cold, couldn't hear the storm, only the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears like a funeral bell no one had the mercy to ring. I reached up, took the collar, and on the bark of the tree, a smear of red. Not much, but enough. Enough to know Scout fought. And Scout was taken. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the woods, fingers clenched around that collar, snow piling on my shoulders, flashlight dead in my hand. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't fall to my knees, because the worst kind of grief isn't the kind that breaks you. It's when you realize there's nothing left to break. I returned to the cabin near dawn, my face pale, hands stiff, still holding Scout's collar. I hung it on the wall beside the door where he used to sleep every night, and from that day on, he never came back. Have you ever lived in a house where the only warmth left disappeared one day and never returned if you have type when there's no one left to call? Day 210. The cabin is no longer a shelter. That's what I wrote, hands shaking. The ink smeared. The fire burned low. Ranger let out a soft whinny from the stall, like he too was looking for his friend. I sat by the hearth, and I understood there was no one left to talk to, no one to protect, and no one to protect me. That night I didn't sleep. The lamp stayed on. The fire never dimmed. But inside me something had gone completely cold. No more Scout's soft snores by the door. No gentle warmth against my feet when the night dipped below zero. Only wind and the hollow in my chest, a hollow no creature will ever fill again. Part 7. The Effigy and the Spirit Invitation. Not every gift is goodwill, and not every silence is forgetfulness. I woke at 5:23 a.m., not from sound, not from light, just a feeling, like something was waiting for me outside. I threw on my coat, opened the front door, and there it was. Right on the top step, a stone, smooth, perfectly round, so precise it could have taken hours to shape. But no tool marks, no chisel, no blade. Beside it, 3 strands of foxtail grass braided tightly with a thin strip of twine. And at the center, a small effigy, carved from pine, about the length of my hand. Its face was indistinct, worn, or unfinished. But its arms, one of them stretched outward, as if offering, as if inviting. I stood still. Not a sound, no wind, no footprints, only me and a wordless invitation from whatever had walked through the dark last night. Have you ever received something you didn't dare open, not because it scared you, but because you knew whatever it meant? Something would begin the moment you accepted it. If so, say, I don't know if I should accept it. I didn't bring the gifts inside, left them where they were, chalked a mark around them in case a raccoon or fox was involved. The next morning they were gone, replaced by something else. This time, 2 sticks dry and brittle tied together in an X, a bundle of wild herbs, muskroot, mint, dried maple leaves bound with tree bark, and a new effigy. But this one had a face, and on that face, a carved mark, a scar beneath the left eye, exactly like mine. I sat down in the snow, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The figure's back was slightly hunched, left arm shorter than the right, just like me. My heartbeat pounded through my chest, not from fear, but from recognition. They hadn't just seen me, they had studied me and remembered. Scout had 1, 2 day 4. I woke early, fog clung to the trees, the world wet and gray. I opened the door. This time the gift wasn't centered on the step. It was off to the side, right where Scout used to sleep. It was smaller, carved from blackened wood, ears pointed, eyes large, no collar. I dropped to my knees, didn't cry, didn't wail, just reached out with shaking fingers and touched the little chest carved into its surface. There a tiny cut like someone had opened its heart and stitched it back with wood grain. Have you ever seen someone carve the spirit of someone you loved without using a single word? Then you understand. You know what it means to stand at the edge between communion and possession. My first response. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the window watching the wooden effigies resting on my table beside the fire. They weren't threatening. They weren't frightening. They were knowing. They knew who I was, what I'd loved, what I feared losing most. And sometime after midnight, I stood up. I took a sliver of pine, carved a new figure, just the size of a thumb. No face, no arms, only one letter etched into the chest, S. I didn't know why, didn't know what it meant, didn't know what it would start. But I placed it outside, right in the center of the clearing, under the cold, watching moon. For the first time, I didn't just observe, I answered. Day 223. I'm no longer the only one keeping quiet. That's what I wrote in my journal, my hand unsteady. I used to think I was the recluse, the man recording the footprints of something unnamed. But now I understand I've always been in the middle of this conversation. I just hadn't been brave enough to reply. The next morning, my figure was gone. In its place, a white stone, etched with a strange mark, two intersecting curves, like two ripples crossing in a still pond. Not a human symbol, not one I'd ever seen before. But I knew. They had heard. And now they were waiting for the next reply. I closed my journal, snuffed the flame, looked out at the tree line. This wasn't fear anymore. Wasn't trust either. It was something else, communication. The kind that outlives language, outlasts species, and stretches beyond loneliness itself. Have you ever stood before something you didn't understand and answered it anyway because your heart wouldn't let you walk away? If you have, leave a comment. I've answered with silence too. Part 8. The Ritual in the Dark. I used to think I survived, but maybe I was only kept to witness something no one should ever see. That night wasn't cold. No snow, no wind, not even the usual sounds of the forest. It was like the entire woods were holding their breath. I sat by the window. The oil lamp had gone out hours ago. Only the faintest wash of moonlight slipped through the dusty glass. At first I thought I was hearing things, but then the footsteps came, slow, measured, like ancient drums from a time before memory. I stepped out onto the porch, eyes straining in the sickle moonlight, and that's when I saw them. 8 shadows, tall, still, silent. They didn't come toward me, didn't raise their arms, didn't speak. They circled the cabin. Have you ever seen something that didn't try to harm you, but whose presence alone made you feel like you were being offered up? Then say it, now. I'm no longer human. I couldn't look away. Their spacing was exact. Their pace synchronized. 1 step, 2 steps, turn, repeat. Again, 8 of them. Then 16 steps, then 8 again. A cycle, measured, deliberate, like a rite from a world that had forgotten humans ever existed. I held my rifle, but I couldn't lift it, because for the first time in my life I understood. I wasn't prey. I was the ritual, when the gaze is not human anymore. One of them stopped by the eastern corner of the cabin. It turned its head, but not toward the house. Toward me. It didn't reach, didn't move, just watched. And I stood there still breathing, but feeling like nothing more than a husk. That gaze, though I couldn't see its face, I felt something inside me crack. It wasn't hate, wasn't rage, wasn't a plea. It was recognition, the kind that says, I see you, I know what you are, and you don't. I took 1 step back, and all of them stopped. The wind didn't move. The fire was dead. The night went still like the surface of a frozen lake. Have you ever been looked at in a way that made you unsure if your soul still belonged to your body? Then leave the words, I used to be human, but I'm not sure anymore. They resumed walking, as if nothing had happened. But I understood now. It wasn't an attack, not a warning, not a threat. It was an assessment. They were studying me, measuring my stillness, memorizing how I reacted, how I breathed. I wasn't being stalked. I was being evaluated. I looked around. No scout, no ranger, no Helen, no one, just me and them. And I knew I wasn't chosen to survive. I was kept to witness. Day 234. No one remains a witness except me. That's what I wrote when dawn finally broke. By then they were gone. No footprints, no voices, no carved effigies. Just me. The cabin, the sharp scent of smoldered wood, and a splitting headache that felt like it came from someplace deeper than bone. I don't know if what I saw was a ritual or just the first time they let me see them as they are. But I do know one thing: I can't go back. I can't unsee. I can't pretend I wasn't the center of it. I sat by the table, looked at my hands, wood dust in the creases. My eyes stung. I hadn't slept in days, and I understood. I wasn't a mountain man anymore, not a recluse, not a survivor, not even a witness. I was someone they had seen. And once they see you, they never forget. Have you ever become the focus of something you didn't ask for, didn't invite, but it chose you anyway? If so, type I was chosen, even when I didn't want to be. Part 9. The Last Stand in the Horse Barn. Sometimes the only way to survive is to break the silence you swore you'd never betray. Day 243. I wrote in my journal, Ranger sees something I don't. 3 nights. My old horse hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, hadn't moved. He just stood head fixed toward the woods, like he'd been bewitched by something I couldn't hear. I tried leading him from the stall. He pulled away, growled. And yes, I know how strange that sounds. But when an old horse you've lived with for 4 years looks at you like you're the predator, you start questioning what you are. That night he kicked the back wall of the barn and let out a scream I didn't think horses were capable of making. Have you ever watched the gentlest creature you know become so foreign you were afraid to go near it? Then say, I was once looked at like a stranger. At 2:00 a.m., I woke to the sharp crack of wood. Not the barn, the front door. I scrambled, grabbed the Remington I hadn't loaded in 8 months, sat on the floor barrel pointed at the door. Something was pressing on it from the outside. Not pounding, not ramming, just leaning steady, heavy, intentional. I didn't shake, didn't flinch, but inside, a familiar frozen ache returned, the same one I felt the day I got served divorce papers, the day Emma called me Mr. Jim, instead of Dad. It wasn't fear of dying. It was the fear of no longer being anyone at all. The pressure stopped, silence, and then a different sound, from the barn. Ranger's scream. I ran outside. Cold wind sliced my face. The moon hung like a fingernail above the trees. I saw the shape of the barn and something shoving the door from the outside. Not pounding, not clawing, just testing, pushing, like it was learning what would break first. Inside, Ranger screamed, not neighed, not whinnied, screamed, like a creature undone from the inside. I bolted across the yard, heart slamming like a war drum, and then I saw them. 4 more shadows standing silently at the forest's edge, watching, waiting. I didn't think, didn't choose, I just raised my rifle. Have you ever broken your own promise not out of fear, but because you couldn't take 1 more second of silence? Then write it. I fired into the quiet. The shot, 1 shot, that's all. I fired into the barn door at the figure pressing it. No scream, no blood, no fall. It just stopped. Took 1 step back. Turned to face me. No eyes. No face. But I felt the gaze. I knew it looked at me. And the others, all 4, took 1 synchronized step forward. My breath caught in my throat. I shouted, I have more rounds. Step back. They didn't move. Ranger burst through the barn wall from the inside. Wood shattered. He shot past me, wild-eyed, galloping straight into the woods. Didn't even look at me. Didn't stop. I wanted to run after him, but I couldn't move. I'd fired. I'd broken the unspoken rule, the covenant I never understood. Now all I could do was wait. The aftermath morning came. No shadows, no prints, no ranger, just a broken barn and a new effigy. It sat quietly on the front step. Carved with care, it was me, no doubt. Long hair, left hand holding a rifle, a small hole in the chest like a bullet wound. I dropped to my knees. Didn't cry, didn't scream. Just picked it up, laid it on my chest, and lay down on the porch floor watching the pale sky begin to peel the moon away. Have you ever screamed only to find the silence answered louder than your voice? Then leave this, I spoke up, and the silence only deepened. I didn't die that night, but something inside me never came back to the cabin again. I still live. I still eat. Still keep the fire going. Still clean the floors. But I no longer write in the journal each day. No longer carve. No longer speak out loud. Because I know I am no longer Jim Morris. I am the one who fired. And to them, that's all it took for everything to change. Part 10. The Retreat and the Silent Legacy. I left the forest, but I couldn't take myself with me. I walked away from the cabin just after dawn when the sunlight was soft enough to reveal the dried blood on the front steps. No snow, no wind, only the kind of silence that feels cold like stone carved for headstones. I led a borrowed horse down the mountain. Not Ranger. He disappeared the night I fired the shot. This horse rented from the town's southern station had no bond with me, but no betrayal either. 3 leather saddlebags hung off the sides. One held film canisters, one held effigies, the third my journals. 5 years' worth. Except for the last night. I wrote nothing then. I wasn't running, I wasn't banished, I just no longer had anyone to stay for. Have you ever left a place you once called home, not because you were pushed, but because you knew you didn't belong there anymore? Then say I left before I could be forgotten. I reached a little town called Miners Hollow. 1 gas station, 1 bar, 1 retired sheriff, and a photo booth that hadn't worked properly in 20 years. People looked at me like a ghost that had forgotten how to die. No one asked questions, but they whispered, like I was someone who'd come back from something I wasn't supposed to survive. I sat at the bar, placed a photo on the counter, clear, crisp, 18-inch footprint, tin can next to it for scale. The bartender stared, said nothing, pushed it back. A younger guy walking past muttered, "Just clean your lens, old man, and come back to the real world." I didn't respond, because if you have to beg someone to believe you, their belief isn't worth holding. I mailed copies of the photo's soil samples with compacted prints and one of the wooden effigies to the Federal Forestry Service. 3 months later, I got a letter, unable to verify samples. Prints do not match any known species. Cease and desist unauthorized activity on protected lands. No one followed up. No journalists, no headlines, no podcast interviews about my miraculous survival. I existed, but no one acknowledged that I had endured something real. Have you ever told the truth only to be met with the kind of silence reserved for liars, then say, "I lived through it even if no one believed me"? Helen and the silence that outlived the forest. I walked into Helen's diner one last time. She'd aged. Her eyes had gone pale like smoke. She paused when she saw me, said only, "I thought you'd become one of them by now." I sat down, placed an effigy on the table. She didn't flinch, didn't ask, just picked it up gently, held it like something old and sacred, then whispered, "They don't choose to kill, they choose to remember. But you fired. So now you're caught between both." I nodded. There was nothing else to say. I sold the cabin, never went back to get the rest. Left the wood stove, the old bed, the door that had once been shoved from the outside but now stood quiet like nothing had ever happened. I didn't stay in town, didn't return to the city, bought a small house near the borderlands, no phone, just an old radio, and a stack of photos I no longer showed anyone. Each night I light a candle, place it in the window, and I think, Scout, if you're still out there, would you forgive me? Would he say I stayed to the very end? But yes, you fired. I don't want forgiveness. I just want to see his eyes again. Even if only from the tree line. Even if he's no longer a dog anymore. The last line I ever wrote in the old journal was, "I used to write to prove I was right. Now I write just to remember I still exist." I don't need you to believe me. I only need you to know that deep in the American wilderness there are things that don't need to be understood, but must be respected. And if you ever hear barking from deep in the trees, don't call out, don't chase, don't answer, because not everything that wants to be found wants to be saved. Ending whisper, the last words of Jim Morris. If you've ever chosen silence over revenge, leave a comment. I understand, Jim. If you've ever survived something you couldn't name, write, I'm still here. Sometimes I wonder if Scout's still out there, running with something not quite wolf, not quite man, something the forest has kept secret long before we ever walked into it. I used to think I'd lost everything, but maybe what hurts the most is not losing, but not knowing whether you were left behind, or just not followed. Even now when the wind dies and the fire's gone out, I still hear movement in the woods. Not deer, not the breeze, something walking upright, deliberate, patient, just standing there, still as the last time Scout turned to look at me before disappearing into that white void. Maybe he's still alive. Maybe he became part of them, part of something we don't have a name for, just fear or deny. And I wait, not to see him again, not even to be forgiven, just to know, did he forgive me? Have you ever lived in silence so long that you began to realize you were never truly alone in it when the forest is around you and within you? If you were Jim, would you have left or stayed just to understand the end of it all? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story pulled loose a memory you thought you'd buried long ago, leave a comment, "I understand, Jim." And tell us on a scale from 0 to 10, how deeply did this journey leave its mark? And if you've ever believed that some things do exist even when no one else does, then the next story will take you deeper into the place where silence isn't peace anymore, but a warning. Stay close. The forest still remembers your footsteps.